the body of God is actually a Hindu term. In Hinduism, we have many spiritual traditions. There is one particular.
The Ricci Legacy Symposium was concerned not just with the past, but with the way enculturation is practiced in today's world. The reality of cultural adaptation in India was explored in workshops by Father Michael Amaladas, a noted Jesuit theologian from South India who has written extensively on enculturation and interreligious dialogue. We also had the chance to talk to him in person about his experience. Father Amaladas, would you mind starting by telling us how enculturation came to be a priority in the Society of Jesus?
I think for us Jesuits, eventually it goes back to Father Aruppi. And we had a very small decree on enculturation in Congregation 32. But that's a very small thing. So there was some idea that, that we have to attend to culture, and then somehow the gospel should enter into a culture, incarnate in a culture in order to transform that culture. So in the 34th General Congregation, we really felt that in order to really to promote justice, we also have to transform culture and transform religion. And this was partly inspired, I would say, by the Asians, because in Asia, once again, already in 1974, there was a meeting of all the Asian bishops gathered together in what we call here the Federation of Asian Bishops' Conferences. And they said evangelization is the dialogue of the gospel with the realities of Asia. And they identified the realities of Asia as the many poor, the rich cultures, and the living religions of Asia. The term engaging with culture becomes important. And it is this context, I myself, for instance, have written a book called Beyond Inculturation, because the term inculturation itself becomes questionable. The term inculturation is patterned on incarnation, just as the Word of God becomes incarnate in Judaic, in Judaism, in order to transform humanity. The same way the gospel has to become incarnate in a culture. But incarnation is not enough. So you have to transform culture.
When you say the gospel needs to be incarnate in a culture, and you have to transform a culture, what does that mean?
Inculturation really happens when a local group of people who hear the challenge of the gospel and who respond to this challenge by being converted, by changing their mindset, by changing their attitudes, by changing their basic options in life and so on. And therefore, and this they do when this response takes place in terms of their culture, their language, their symbols, their celebrations, their social structures and so on. And therefore, inculturation is really a dialogue between a local community which receives the gospel. What happens in this situation, of course, is that the emphasis is not so much on the missionary who comes from outside, but rather on the people. The missionary facilitates, communicates the gospel. And for that purpose, we would say he has to acculturate himself. That is, he has to, maybe suppose a missionary comes to China, he has to learn Chinese, to speak to the people, and perhaps translate the gospel into Chinese to retell the stories of Jesus. But ultimately, it is the Chinese people who respond to the gospel in terms of their culture and build up a Chinese Christianity, a Chinese church, a Chinese liturgy, a Chinese theology, and so on.
How important would you say dialogue with other religions is in the process of enculturation?
Religion is the deepest element in culture. Therefore, an intercultural dialogue also involves today necessarily an interreligious dialogue, and these both go hand in hand together. But the goal always is that we want to transform society. We want to transform humanity. We want to rebuild a new humanity of justice, of fellowship, peace, mutual love, and sharing and service and so on. Therefore, the focus remains faith and justice. But today we feel that we cannot really dialogue with faith and dialogue with justice unless we dialogue also with cultures and religions. But in the concrete, is the church really ready for this dialogue? In India, for instance, the church would still be seen as a foreign entity culturally, because today it is true that we worship in Indian languages, but much of our symbols, our structures, they're all still heavily Latin based, or Roman based, what you call the Roman rite of the liturgy, for instance. Much of our theology today, of course, we are trying to promote Indian theology, but still we are inheritors of a Western theology that has come to us through our teachers and so on, though we are making effort. So therefore, we cannot authentically dialogue with the Indian people, Indian cultures and so on, unless somehow we become Indian, somehow throw off all this foreign heritage, which have come through the missionaries over the last, say, 300-400 years. And we become more and more Indian in our reflection, in the way we worship, in the language we use, in our symbols, cultural symbols, artistic symbols and art, spirituality and all that. So this is a challenge. I want to dialogue with Indian culture. What is Indian culture? Because India is a big country, and let us say there's not only one Indian culture, there are many cultures, Indian culture. Of course, there is a englobing kind of a culture, if you like, but there are also a lot of cultural conflicts between dominant cultures and subaltern cultures. We have the caste system in India, and we also have, let us say, the multiplicity of languages. We have at least 14 major languages, and a language is always a center also for culture. And therefore, there is no one Indian culture. Therefore, we are facing a multiplicity of cultures, and these cultures themselves are often in conflict.
But isn't globalization changing that? Aren't local cultures becoming less distinct? Does that change the way we enculturate?
Of course, we are living in a globalizing world today, and therefore, so we are not simply addressing Indians in the abstract, but Indians who are living in a global world today who are open to some of the young people, maybe perhaps they may look at least more American than Indian. So we are actually living in a multicultural communities today, especially in urban situations, and we have to take that into account, and that becomes complex. So in that sense, that I cannot do it alone, because I am not a master of all these different cultures and so on. So it becomes also a group affair that I may have. I might be able to dialogue with some particular groups. I should have companions who can handle other cultural orientations, talk different languages, reach out to the youth, reach out to the elders. So it's really a complex affair. It might look very simple if you talk in the abstract, but in the concrete, it is a very complex process that is going on.
You talk about letting your spirituality become more Indian, and your own tradition is Ignatian spirituality. Can you give us an example of how the dialogue happens between your Ignatian spirituality and your Indian spirituality?
The Indian spirituality feel much more at home with, let us say, the whole Indian vision of the oneness of being, the Advaita, non-duality, that God is not out there as a creator, outside the universe as a kind of a watchmaker, but God is within, in us. He is in our hearts. He is in every, He is in creation. He is in the others. He is in me. Therefore, as a basic principle of unity and fellowship, and which we can discover through our love, relationship of love and selfless service, sharing, and so on and so forth. So some of these kind of integrative, unitive principles we'll be highlighting much more in Indian spirituality. A whole dichotomous thing where God, creation, the divine, human, body, soul, which might characterize certain Western tendencies, we would downgrade them, and push more for this Advaitic, non-dual kind of a thing. And then, of course, what happens precisely in order to promote this, we'll be making use of Hindu scriptures, so spiritual writings or Hindu devotional poems and so on, where this spirituality is expressed. So we'll make use of them, and let's say in the exercises side by side with the scriptures, we also make use of Hindu scriptures, Hindu devotional poems, or We'll also use techniques like the yoga, breathing, for instance, posture, and therefore in some of the methods of prayer, we will use Indian methods of prayer, sometimes maybe Buddhist concentration and so on. And we would feel quite free because Ignatius of Loyola says in his exercises that he is open to any exercise that will lead us to God.
Father Amaladas, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.